All right, so this is a progress update for the design of All Systems Nominal. It is, of course, the Mecha RPG, tabletop RPG I am working on. And I've been working on it now for probably about half a year. It's in beta at the moment. You can find it if you just go check out at ASN RPG, or check the video description for that link on Twitter. And I think the game is in a transition point right now. I ran it at GauntletCon. You can go check out the entire session on my channel. I was running a scenario set in the Front Mission universe. And that was set just at the end of the Second Huffman conflict. So that was really following my original design intentions for the game, which was to create something that would allow players to drop in existing mecha settings and play them out on the tabletop without a ton of rules overhead or prep or complication necessary. So I've run a BattleTech game and I've run a Front Mission game with the system. And what else should I mention as background information? This game started out as kind of a hack of World of Dungeons Turbo, which is a sort of sister game to Blades in the Dark by John Harper. Both games are by John Harper. And therefore, it was taking a lot of influences from OSR game design. And what is sort of characteristic of OSR game design, and if you want to hear more about this, go check out the panel I was just on at GauntletCon about hacking OSR games for different genres. But what is characteristic of OSR games that I brought into the design of All Systems Nominal is a lot of sort of rules lightness, keeping the rules very sparse, and a lot of openness to hacking, just sort of creating a lot of spaces where things can be slotted into the game. If you think about BX D&D, like super old school D&D, a lot of that game relied on sort of homebrew hacks. A lot of the game relied on modules that players could play with that would alter the character of the game. For example, going from standard D&D to playing Castle Ravenloft, right? Like that alters the themes and the behavior of Dungeons and Dragons, because it makes it into a gothic horror game instead of a dungeon crawling sort of fantasy western treasure hunting game. If I had to sort of describe what Dungeons and Dragons fiction is usually like, and what you see in something like Keep on the Borderlands. So anyway, this kind of openness, this kind of lightness, these were things that I brought into the game with the aspiration that players would be able to take the mecha settings and mecha fiction that they love from old school mecha games like BattleTech, like Heavy Gear, like Front Mission, right? Take that old school mecha fiction or mecha RPG stuff and fit it into a more like kind of modern, kind of old school, but very lightweight, very easy to pick up and play game system. And I was hoping that would really answer a need for people in terms of just letting them, relive this fiction that they liked as kids or discover it for the first time. Unfortunately, in playtesting, I haven't seen that work out very well. There's a lot of reasons why that's the case. So, for example, OSR design, as I say here, right? OSR design offers a lot of freedom to game groups, but depth of knowledge isn't out there to take advantage of it. Now, am I saying that there's nobody out there that knows the BattleTech universe? Of course not, right? Like, come on, it was a major, major property, and there are huge fans of that setting, right? There are people who've read all the novels. There are people who have played the video games. There are people who've played the tabletop game or the MechWarrior RPG, right? All of those things. But in playtesting, I found that the depth of knowledge just wasn't out there, even for people who were tabletop gamers at the time that BattleTech was at its zenith, right? There were some people, you know, it feels like maybe the fandoms are a little bit scattered. Like, some people were into Heavy Gear, other people were into BattleTech, other people were into Macross, whatever. By the way, don't run Macross with this game. It's just not going to work. It's not designed for that at all. But yeah, it just... You know, when you run a game like World of Dungeons or World of Dungeons Turbo and you bring in all these D&D tropes, people just pick that up and run with it, right? Because they've got that depth of knowledge. It's out there. It's just suffused the culture. Doesn't matter, young or old, people understand D&D. And that just isn't really true of mecha fiction. Maybe because the fandom is so scattered between like super robot stuff, Transformer stuff, the kind of gritty like Maschinen Kriege or like BattleTech or Front Mission kind of stuff versus the Gundam, which can be a little bit more out there or very out there in the case of G Gundam. It feels like there's so much variety in the mecha genre that it doesn't really coalesce into a coherent basis for play that you need if you're running with a very, very simple rule system. And I found this in initial playtesting with just using essentially modified World of Dungeons rules. So, you know, very simple mechanics, just like a couple combat mods, working with HP and damage, and, you know, rolling 2d6 plus a mod to see if you hit. People just couldn't form the fiction in their heads in the way that they can with World of Dungeons. So I started working on that, started making changes. So that was one thing, right? The depth of knowledge isn't out there. Another thing is that the seriousness of making a war game requires more mechanics that express themes. So, you know, people often say that playing an OSR game is like being on campaign. You should treat the campaign in a sense like a war campaign. There's a kind of honesty about the world building, the fiction, the objectivity, the uncaring world that is like war, right? I think that's true. However, in a sense, that reflects some of the objective characteristics of war and perhaps some of the absurdities of war in interesting ways. But it can actually just go gonzo. That's a very difficult balance to hit. And I feel as though if because I'm making a war game, because it's supposed to be a gritty game, this is a mecha game, yes, but it is also a gritty war game. It is inspired by games like Night Witches. I need to be a little bit more hands-on. I need to add a little bit more to the game to neither glorify war excessively, right? And like to sort of glorify the idea of mecha as these incredible superhuman machines that are super cool. Like, I mean, of course they're cool, but we got to understand the problems, right? Like that's something I want to get across. And to also just like avoid going gonzo, right? So yeah, I think all of that is very important, and I want to have some mechanics that hit those points, because in playtesting, the emotional impact of the game has been very weak session to session. Like every session, it just has not hit. It has not hit the themes I want to hit. It has not hit the grit I want to hit. All of those things have not been working. So I feel like I need to dig into the mechanics a little bit more and push that, because just the setting description and just the sort of framing of the game and the basic, very like low-level mechanics do not enforce those themes and express them, at least in the first session. And that's the thing I'll get back to. So the next point is that players were not able to visualize combat without scaffolding, and each pilot was acting independently of the others, losing a sense of teamwork. Okay, so if you've ever played an OSR game with a large number of players, like let's say 6 or 7 players, you'll understand that you spend a lot of time waiting around for your turn. I mean, that's characteristic of all D&D, but like it's very much the case in OSR games because they support a large player count. And you just kind of have this one-to-one relationship between the dungeon master or the GM and the player. And then you go to a new player, you go to a new player, you go to a new player, and everybody's just kind of doing their own thing. And that's kind of okay if your characters are very clearly defined individuals and these kind of like, heroic adventurers, because they can get their own spotlight, and that's fine. But in a mecha game such as this, you want to have that sense of teamwork, of camaraderie, of cooperation and squad tactics and that kind of stuff, right? And you can't really get that out of the basic OSR combat mechanics, because a lot of OSR games, or generally speaking OSR games, do not want you to get into combat necessarily, right? Like a lot of the fun in OSR games is acting cleverly so you don't have to be in combat, so you can get past the enemies, get the treasure, and get out, right? And that's not going to work in a war game. Right? Like, yeah, you can run those kind of missions, but if you're in mechs, I mean, chances are you're going to get into some combat. So, there was that teamwork issue. There was also the visualization issue. And what I ended up doing was adding a lot to the game to address those things, right? So I took a lot of combat ideas from Burning Wheel, from 316, from Firebrands, and that was all to add tactical depth to the game. I introduced the notion of a commanding officer, and I introduced those story prompts from Firebrands when you do a maneuver, which allows you to show how your character is acting in relation to the other pilots. So it creates a little bit of a horizontal narrative space between players instead of a purely siloed top-down experience. I don't think it's perfect yet, but it's getting there. Like, you know, making a game, making a mech game with a compelling combat system as an RPG is a really serious design challenge, and I am pretty happy so far with where I've got. Like, I feel like I've made some successful design decisions. It's not all the way there yet, but it definitely feels like this is some good tech. This is a well thought up system. I've got lots of positive feedback about the combat system. It's the tonal stuff that isn't working right now. So I think moving away from that very basic OSR combat system and towards something that is similar to Burning Wheel but lower crunch has really helped. So it's also, you know, got a lot of blades in there, a lot of blades in the dark in there too. So very eclectic kind of mashup of different ideas about combat, but seems to be working. Then this one, OSR games need some time to develop their themes, but people playing demos of the game won't be able to experience that. So, you know, people say like playing an OSR game is like being out on campaign, right? There's a kind of objectivity to the world and a kind of negotiation of scarcity in space and decisions that is similar to, say, being behind enemy lines or, you know, being on a giant front like, say, the Eastern Front in World War II. That is all very true. And I think there are themes implicit in OSR games that really do develop the more you play. But people playing demos of this game are only going to get to see the first session. So if I don't bring in some story game mechanics to sort of prime the narrative situation, they're never going to see the themes of the game develop. And I feel like that's really going to hurt word of mouth excitement about the game. Because, yeah, a nice combat system is cool. It's some cool tech, but you know what people really get excited about is interesting character interactions, grappling with problems, and if the combat is cool and evocative, then that's icing on the cake. But it ain't going to get us there, right? If I want this game to get some mind share and to get some word of mouth, I'm going to need to introduce some story game mechanics just to make sure the first session has some impact to it, and people get a little bit of a taste of the emotional tone of the game, and I think that will actually help draw people in so that they can have that experience of the long-term campaign, because there's still ways in which the game is driven from situation to situation by the dice. And it's still an open-ended game. And I think that that's going to retain some of the good points about OSR design, even though I am abandoning that very, very sparse approach to design that is common in the OSR. Okay, so what am I dropping? I'm dropping textual brevity. You know, one of the major things that I was shooting for with All Systems Nominal was a very low page count, because I was like, it's going to be too intimidating if it's too many pages. People just won't read it. It won't go anywhere. People aren't going to play the game. You know, the original idea was, here's a game, you pick it up, you take your favorite mech property from, you know, this short list, whip up a situation based on some old source books you got or whatever, and just get right into playing. You know, experience that fiction that you like. But there's reasons why I feel like I'm gonna need to add some page count. There's gonna be a bit of scope creep in this next section of design, this next stage of design. And that hurts my soul as a designer. It feels like I am going out into the wilds, so to speak. I am being an OSR character on a hex crawl rather than being someone with a clear mission. I'm no longer a Burning Wheel character, and I'm now an OSR hex crawling adventurer. And that isn't a great place to be as a designer. But I've thought this over a lot, and I'm not going to add a ton of pages, but I'm going to add some verbosity to the game, just to make sure certain things that need to hit and need to be in there are addressed. The next thing I'm abandoning, I've already talked about this, is the very light mechanical complexity. In some ways, I've actually stripped the game down in terms of complexity and crunch, right? Like I've simplified the equipment system and so on. But the combat system is far more complex than it used to be. And that's okay. It works, right? It works. It's just that is no longer an OSR style combat system at all. If you want to play that, go play the Mecha Hack, right? Like that does that. And the openness. I'm dropping some of the openness because I want to prescribe tone a little bit more, because I think it's important. As I said, this is military fiction, this is war fiction, and I'm not interested in promoting jingoism. I'm not interested in glorifying war, because personally, as a young boy, as a young man, I played a lot of war games that were, for example, for PC, and the sort of unthinking and just kind of having fun or glorifying tone of a lot of those games, almost pushed me into some really bad life decisions, right? Like I was very much a fanboy of military tech and that sort of techno thriller Tom Clancy style war worship or war tech worship, because that was just so common in the PC gaming scene at the time. And I could have easily ended up in the military. I think that would have been a terrible life decision for me, because I'm not suited to it, and this was just before the Iraq War, so yeah, I know people who fought in that war, and they didn't come out of it with a very great opinion. So I don't want to perpetuate the same thing that led me almost down to some pretty bad paths in my life. So I want to be more intentional, and in order to do that, I need to reduce the degree of freedom in the game. I need to focus it a little bit more, and that's what I'm going to do. So, what am I adding to the game? Well, I'm taking a page from Blades/PBTA. I am adding GM agenda, principles, and categories of consequence. So, because this game is based on Blades, it is a Forged in the Dark game fundamentally, although there's a lot of differences between this and Blades. It doesn't make sense to talk about GM moves, right? There are no moves in Blades in the Dark, right? You just have roles and the consequences that flow out of roles. And so instead of talking about GM moves, I'm talking about categories of consequence, right? Like, what kinds of consequences should you see in a game of All Systems Nominal? Aside from that, agenda and principles are very much similar to what you might find in PBTA games, in Blades, and also in specifically Night Witches and a handful of other games I've taken ideas from. So it's not just a copy paste of the agenda principles from Night Witches, of course. I've modified it to fit the fiction. I've added my own things, but that was a major inspiration there. Because I think Night Witches is a pretty solid military role-playing game. It has the grit that I'm looking for in All Systems Nominal. So, what else am I adding? I'm adding extensive safety tools and a framework to use them, because I realized, I was thinking back on like the last session I ran of this game, and I was thinking about why did it feel like such a popcorn action flick, right? Like, why was there no weight to it? Why was there no impact? Why was there no grit? When all of these things I had written into my GM agenda and principles, and I had referenced those before starting play, right? Like, I had them in the back of my head, but I did not make them happen in play. Was it because the mechanics were too weak? Yes, to some extent. We'll get into that. But also because I think I was personally concerned about stressing players out or stressing myself out. And I was like, you know what I need is I really need some better safety tools in this game. And that will let me, as a designer and as a GM, dig more into the grit and the sort of the grind and the grim tone of the fiction that I want to hit, instead of just doing popcorn action flicks. Because I'll feel safer, right? I will feel safer. I need to feel safe before I can really get into the right design headspace. So that's where I'm starting there. I'm going to add starting units to the game. So this is not talking about like, you know, individual units. This is like the special forces, like the special forces unit, the rebels unit, the shock troop unit, right? Like, there will be different sort of recipes of units, like, because this game is played with 1 GM and 4 players. I can be very very precise about what sort of starting situation you can choose, and you know, because the number doesn't vary. And so I'm not going to introduce crew sheets like in Blades in the Dark. What I'm going to do is basically give you like a recipe of things that influence your character creation and your starting situation. And then from there, you just play the game, right? Like, there's no crew advancement. There's no crew moves to take or anything like that. It's just, here's a starting situation you get. Figure out what that looks like for your individual characters, given the setting that you've come up with, and then you're off to the races, right? Then you can leave behind that starting unit stuff. So the overhead should be fairly low. I'm going to introduce flaws. Like, I'm not sure about this wording, but you know, some kind of quirk about mecha to help complicate them, make them a little bit more interesting. I think for some crews, such as, for example, or sorry, I should say units, for example, the Special Forces unit, that probably isn't going to be a thing so much because they're very well equipped, but there will be other compensating things that they have to deal with that offset that. Right, but if you're the rebels, well, you got flaws plenty, right? Like, you're hard scrabble. Relationships. Yes, I'm going to introduce some character relationships to start out with, because the characters just aren't, even if you do free play when you start the game, the characters just aren't closely connected enough. We need some of this to help build that sense of camaraderie, which is super, super important in a military fiction game. Next, I'm going to have troubles. So these are like personal flaws. Basically like vices in Blades in the Dark in a sense. It was something I didn't really want to bring into the game, but I'm going to have to add some character depth. And those things can be very powerful narratively. So I think it's going to be worth buying that, or like spending that extra complexity to get something more narratively satisfying. All right, so next thing, I'm going to talk about how I'm going to divide game management responsibilities in this game. I got these ideas from Jason Morningstar's games, but mainly from Garrett's post on the Gauntlet blog about managing games, sharing responsibility. I will add that to the show notes so you can go check it out. It's really good. So I was talking about how safety tools are really important for me to continue to progress as a designer in this space. But another thing that's really important, I think, is dividing game administration responsibilities among the players in such a way that there is GM accountability, but there is also lower GM responsibility, and that will allow the GM to kind of like focus in more on hitting the right tone. So I've kind of like talked about this as like a staff role, like general staff sort of, and I've come up with roles that combine different duties in a kind of military way, right? So we have an operations officer, like one player will play this role. In the fiction, no, but like at the meta level, at the player level, they will be playing this role. So the operations officer is responsible for timekeeping, right? Like when do we need to take breaks? When are we an hour out from the end of the game? All that kind of stuff. The operations officer is also responsible for debrief. This means the GM is not responsible for debrief. I think that's very important because the GM is the central agent of antagonism in the game. And having the GM also be the person responsible for administering check-in and kind of like the debrief process of stepping away from the game and reflecting on the experience, I think is not always ideal. So I'm interested in having somebody who is not the antagonist in the game, is not representing the antagonist, manage the debriefs. The operations officer will also be responsible for after action reports or AARs. This is a separate thing from debriefs. The AARs are going to be about feedback. Okay, so debriefs are going to be about giving stars to other players in terms of I appreciated your play in this way. It's going to be about stepping away from the characters. It's going to be about reflecting on the experience emotionally. And it's also going to be about connecting the game experience to the real world in terms of war, conflict, hierarchy, all the kind of stuff that's going to come up in this game. All right, the AARs, on the other hand, are going to be recap of what happened in the last session, and also this operations officer is going to be responsible for pulling the group in terms of what feedback they have for the game, right? Like what was good, what was bad, what needs to change. All of those comments can be compiled into the AAR and then shared with the group. And this is not going to be the GM's responsibility. This will be the operations officer's responsibility. The next person is going to be the logistics officer. The logistics officer will handle the tech, so they will handle like setting up a Google Hangout, or let's say managing printing documents, character sheets. Yes, Christo. I absolutely agree. This is very similar to old D&D. I was very much thinking about the collar in old D&D when I came up with this idea, or sort of adapted what Garrett was writing. Am I planning on having the roles both be real and in the game somehow? Definitely not. I think that it's important that they remain distinct, and I'm still on the fence about these labels if they're too close to the game fiction. Because I think that when you get into debrief and intersession stuff, yeah, exactly. It's really important to maintain a distinction between the character and the player. So I think that although, yeah, exactly, de-rolling. So although I think these labels are intuitive and they fit into the tone of the game, they may be too close to the fiction, and so I might have to adjust this. I might have to make it less of a military thing, just to make sure that there is dissonance between those two levels and that people can separate them from each other. So it's a thought, something I've definitely thought about. So yes, the logistics officer will be doing tech stuff, providing character sheets, all that kind of stuff if you're playing offline. They will also be responsible for online document maintenance. So this is like getting a character keeper together, making sure it's up to date, having rules documents available for the group in like Roll20 or whatever. That kind of thing will be logistics officer's responsibility, and that's going to take pressure off of the GM, right? The next role is going to be, or not role, I should say, the next responsibility will be the chaplain. The chaplain is responsible only for safety. And what I mean by that is that the chaplain needs to be watching the players in the game for signs of discomfort. The chaplain needs to be doing check-ins. The chaplain needs to talk about pausing the game where necessary, or fast-forwarding things. Basically, the idea here is that if a player is delegated a role of safety officer, they will feel empowered to act on the use of safety tools. Of course, safety is the responsibility of everybody at the table, but if it is their role, they may be more active in using the safety tools, because it is quite possible in a session to become paralyzed by the flow of the narrative, and feel as though you don't have the right to use the safety tools. So the chaplain is there to make sure everybody feels safe. That's all they're there for in terms of their sort of extra fictional role, because that's already a lot, right? That's a lot on their plate. And I'm definitely going to include something in the chaplain description, saying like, this is a role that involves a lot of emotional labor, possibly, and it is a role that, because of the sort of gender roles that are common in our society, it is a role that women may be qualified to do well, but that does not mean that they having the qualifications or having the ability and the experience does not imply like consent with taking on that role, and it also doesn't imply like emotional capacity in any given situation to do so. So I really want to have like a discussion over who takes on the chaplain role, so that it doesn't just default to women, because that's like not good. Like, it should not be like, oh, of course, you're a woman, you need to do the emotional labor. No, I think there needs to be some kind of discussion about that to be clear about who's feeling up to the job, as opposed to just, yes, thanks, Christo. I'll be in touch. Thanks for watching. Yeah, who's capable of it? Who has the emotional bandwidth at the moment, instead of just who is used to doing emotional labor. The next role here is going to be the adjutant. The adjutant is going to be responsible for orientation. So this is going to be getting people up to speed. What happened last session? What is the game about? They'll be responsible for sort of like reading out the cats at the beginning of the session, that kind of thing. And the adjutant is also responsible for rules knowledge. So will the GM know the rules? Like, yeah, I mean, to some extent, yes. But the adjutant is going to be responsible for looking up rules, that kind of thing. And that's going to allow the GM to focus more on the fiction. And finally, we have the GM, right? This is the traditional role. But it's got only a few things you need to worry about. It's going to have, the GM is, of course, responsible for antagonism and consequences, right? So representing the antagonists in the game, representing the consequences of bad rolls. That's part of the GM's job. The GM's also responsible for, spotlight management, right? Who gets highlighted? Who gets highlighted in a scene? That's going to be the GM's job. That kind of editorial role. And then finally, narrative coherence, right? Like making sure people's narratives are working together with each other, and making a compelling narrative experience for everybody. But so all of the other stuff the GMs usually do, like, and I guess I should add this as well, which is going to be the GM is responsible for prep, right? Like for fictional prep, fictional / like situational prep, because that is a reasonable job, but they're not responsible for things like getting a character keeper together, or making sure that everybody knows the rules. That is on the other people in the group. And as somebody who I feel like I am a good GM. I am a very proactive GM. I am a responsible GM. But especially in very high time pressure games, I feel a lot of stress as a GM because of all these different things I need to do. And I think that tends to make me overmanage games in order to sort of like protect myself, right? And I think it hinders the quality of my GMing. So this is part of where my motivation is coming from. I want to be a better GM who is both less exhausted by the experience, feels less like I am doing more work than everybody else at the table, and also it is able to avoid overmanaging the game because of fear of failure or fear of letting people down, or just the desire to keep pacing up in the game. And so by dividing out the different roles, I think everybody will be able to be a little bit more conscious at the table, and everybody will feel a little bit more responsible about the game, instead of just piling everything on the GM, and leaving the GM feeling a little bit overwhelmed. Yeah. So that's the roles I'm thinking about. The next thing I want to talk about are the safety tools I want to bring into the game. So one safety tool that isn't actually remarked on very much is the resistance roll. It is limited, very limited safety tool, because it is constrained by stress in Blades in the Dark or by edge in my game, and so that makes it, because it is mechanically constrained, it is not adequate. It is like the first line of safety that the players can engage in, right? Like, I don't like that outcome. I'm going to make a resistance roll, and we're going to see what happens differently, right? Like, it's a very, very soft safety tool. Very, very soft adjustment to the fiction that is constrained. Another one I want to bring to the game is script change. Now, you could say, well, if you can just use rewind, right, like script change by Bree Sheldon, if you can just use rewind, why would you ever bother using the resistance roll, right? Because you can do the script change for free. Well, I feel like players are responsible enough to understand that script change is a thing to use in the breach, right? Like, it is a thing that you are going to use when you actually feel emotional stress, as opposed to simply a mild dislike of the fictional outcome. And so having those two things, which on paper look like they do something very similar, I don't think is going to be a problem. Like, I was using it in my playtest session. Nobody was abusing script change there. Both of those mechanics were in the game, and nobody was abusing them. Pause is also available because of script change, right? Pausing the game for just get everybody like getting centered again, and then fast forwarding over things you don't want to see in any detail. There's going to be check-ins, like especially with the chaplain. The chaplain needs to be like willing to pause and check in, right? Like, that's part of their job. It's not like it's everybody's job at the table to be conscious of the other players, but it's not especially the GM's job, and it's not and it is especially the chaplain's job. We're also going to have a debrief procedure as part of the game, starting with Winterhorns. Winterhorn is a game by Jason Morningstar about the tactics that states use against political activists, and it has quite a nice little debrief procedure in there that I think I'm going to start with. I'm going to investigate some other options, but it mostly feels like it's on point in terms of separating the players out from the fiction, saying positive things, talking over emotional stuff, and also relating the game fiction to the real world in a collective way that acknowledges what's been learned in the session, what kind of reflections are there, by keeping things basically quite structured, and also changing space, right? Like, don't debrief in the same place that you were playing, because you need that separation. So all of those things are in Winterhorn. May make some additions or alterations, but that's the basic plan. This is not final, but these are ideas I have at the moment. Mechanical additions. So now we've talked a lot about safety. We've talked a lot about responsibilities at the table. The reason I focused on that so much is because I think those things were really not in the game and really tripping me up as a designer, because I just had too much stress and concern about making a game that was going to hurt people, right? And I don't want to make that game. So focusing on these things is important to me, and it's going to let me free up my head and let me free up my mind space so I can actually do some good design instead of just getting bogged down in self-doubt and that kind of stuff. So mechanical additions, as I said, I'm adding starting units. There's no progression. It's just a starting state. Different units will start with different challenges, narratively and mechanically. So they're both on both levels. They will be distinct from each other, and they'll have different things to worry about. Flaws. This should have almost no overhead because it's just a thing the GM can like factor in as like a -1D in roll calculations. Relationships and troubles. These will flow out of the unit recipe, right? Like what the starting situation is. They should help to kick the story off. Final thing is the dice mechanic changes. I'm probably... more typos. More typos. Probably switching to D10s to increase the difficulty level in light of slightly larger dice pools than Blades, right? Like, because of the way that the dice negotiation works in this game, you end up with like maybe like +1 or possibly even +2 dice over what you might be rolling in Blades, and that's quite consequential when you're using D6s. So I'm going to need to do a little bit of rebalancing to up the difficulty a little bit, because I think it's just too easy at the moment to get like a blowout victory. I'm probably also going to be looking at the balance of the combat system in terms of position and the moves, like the maneuvers, how those play into the position system, and whether there is sufficient dramatic tension in that system at the moment. Yeah, so I feel like there's going to be a lot of balance changes, including possibly a move to D10s over D6s. But I'm going to probably be consulting with some people who are more statistically adept and better at using tools like AnyDice than I am. So that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at with the game. I think it's moving along. I think having had all this thought about responsibilities and safety, I can keep moving, and I can put my initial design ambitions behind me and focus on what I want to do with this, which is to make a mecha game that really highlights a type of fiction that I like a lot, but does not trivialize violence and does not trivialize war. I'm not going to say that this is going to be, a major transformative work of art for a lot of people, but I'm going to do my best, right? I'm going to do my best to be as honest as I can and to be responsible with the art I make. And I feel like that's all I can do. I feel like this is this fiction is, as much as I recognize the difficulties with it, the contradictions of it. It's an important part of my life. It's an important part of what I grew up with, and I want to make this game to just sort of address that part of my life story, and I don't know, after that maybe I'm not going to make any more war games, but I want to make the best one I can at the moment, and I hope that All Systems Nominal is that, and I hope that it is a work of art that is worthwhile both at the level of mechanical design, elegance, and also thematic consistency and expression. So that's it. That's the story so far. There will be more beta versions coming in the near future, so keep watching at ASNRPG for updates, and I will be in touch. I guess I'll have more updates. I'll have more videos probably, and I'll have more APs. Absolutely, we've got one going on the Gauntlet Hangouts soon enough, so I'll be sharing that on this channel and also on Twitter. So thanks for watching. Thanks for your interest, and the campaign carries on.